The spark for the recent mass demonstrations in both Brazil and Turkey stemmed from small issues, public transport fares and the redevelopment of a park. But as we've all seen, they grew into large-scale anti-government protests. For a closer look, I'm joined by Deana Rohlinger. She's an associate professor of sociology at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. Thanks for joining us tonight. What do Turkey and Brazil have in common, or do they have anything in common? You get the sense that there was some sort of a domino effect here. Does watching the protests in one country perhaps inspire another?
Well, that could be the case, but what's really interesting is over the last decade or so, things have improved for the average citizen in both of these countries. So in Brazil, the wage gap has gotten a little bit less and the standards of living have improved. And in Turkey, people have had more say in government. But what's changed as well is people's expectations. And so when the gap gets too great between people's lived realities and their expectations, they can come out in force. And that's what we're seeing happen today.
Well, and you're looking at two countries, both Brazil and Turkey, where maybe you don't expect to see anything like this. They're both somewhat known as more peaceful countries. You don't see a lot going on there. Is there something to be said for that?
Well, I mean, I think that protests can be very visible and can be everyday acts of protest. So what we're seeing now is visible, and I think it's part because you have so many folks using nonviolent civil disobedience. And so it's really difficult when people are calling for their governments to be more responsive to their demands, and they're not acting out, and they're not everyone anyway is destroying property. When you see worldwide these people just making what seem really reasonable demands, they have the moral high ground, and the international community calls on the government to respond.
Well, what about the bigger picture and looking long term? You know, we saw in Brazil that the government did concede on what the protesters were asking for in one instance there. But, you know, in the longer term picture here, will these protesters get what they want?
Well, that's always the big important question, and part of that remains to be seen. If they get organized, average people can do quite a bit. But I think what we see right now is what we've seen over the last few years. People are calling on politicians to be more responsive to their demands, and they see these as their elected officials, and they want a political voice.
We saw a lot of younger people in these protests. What message has that been sending to maybe their fellow citizens and maybe to their respective governments, that we are seeing more and more younger protesters? And I also want to ask you, what will it take for this all to end?
Oh, well, goodness, the contexts are so different. It's hard to say what will cause the protest to completely die down. I mean, even though the government officials have been responsive, part of the issue was they weren't responsive enough initially. I think what's really fascinating about protests is youth become the voice of the next generation. We see our young folks as the future, and so seeing them out there calling on their government to deal with their demands is indeed powerful. But I think they're not the only ones that are protesting. I've read some really moving stories from folks that, in Brazil, for example, that protested in the 70s and are not protesting now, but are there in spirit and sometimes on the sidelines, telling the young people that they're there and they're fighting with them.
All right, Deana Rohlinger, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us on the show.